Good morning, brethren. This morning we're turning to the book of Acts, to Acts chapter 2 and verse 23. And I find this a fascinating verse, a verse that really sets out very clearly what those of us who are reformed in our theology truly believe. This is what the verse says, speaking about Jesus, and it says, "He was handed over to you by God's set purpose and foreknowledge, and you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him on the cross." We know that the Lord Jesus Christ was taken and crucified by the Romans. We also know that the reason that took place was because the leaders of the Jews, inciting the general population of Jerusalem at the time, had brought about circumstances that had put Jesus on trial and ended in him being found guilty and being sentenced to death by crucifixion. Now, Peter, preaching here in the book of Acts chapter 2 in Jerusalem, he says that Jesus was handed over to you by God's set purpose and foreknowledge. In other words, God had always intended, and God had known long beforehand, and it was part of God's plan and purpose that Jesus would be handed over to the Jews, in the sense of him being betrayed, of them wanting to take him, of them bringing false accusations against him, of them taking him to the civil authorities and wanting him crucified. All of this was pre-planned by God. And yet, Peter goes on and he says, "And you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death." You put him to death. They were responsible for their actions. It wasn't that they did what they did because they had no other choice, because God had determined it. They did what they did because that was what they wanted to do. And this is the amazing thing about Reformed theology, or what I like to call it, biblical teaching. This is a wonderful thing about biblical teaching and about God and his plan and his purposes. God can foreordain things. He can plan things. He can purpose things and bring them about. And they're brought about in such a way as to not in any way interfere with the will and the desire of the person involved. They are accountable because they act as they desire. They're not robots. They're not, as it were, puppets on a string that cannot act in any other way. They act personally, choosing what they want to do, and yet, in doing that, they bring about God's purpose. Of course, how could it be otherwise? How could God truly be sovereign and govern the universe if people were able to do what God had not determined? And yet at the same time, in doing what they choose to do, they do it willingly, they do it with desire, they do it because it is their personal choice to do it. They are not being forced to do it. And therefore, they are accountable before God. Isn't this amazing? Jesus was handed over to you by God's set purpose and foreknowledge. And you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him on the cross. Someone who steals can't say, "God made me do it." Someone who commits adultery cannot turn around and say, "Well, this was part of God's plan." Yes, it was, but that does not make you unaccountable for your actions. God is sovereign, but every single one of us is fully responsible for and completely accountable to God with respect to every single one of our actions, our thoughts, our desires, our words. The sovereignty of God on the one hand, the responsibility and accountability of man on the other. It's difficult for us in our limited thinking to be able to bring the two together, but the Bible harmonizes them perfectly. Jesus was handed over to you by God's set purpose and foreknowledge, and you, with the help of wicked men, you put him to death by nailing him on the cross. May God help us to reflect upon these amazing truths. Have a good day, folks.